I saw a very interesting debate taking place on the Boxing Scene forum. Also saw Joe Calzaghe on Ringside today, so I thought I'd put down a few thoughts on the fictional matchup between Sergey Kovalev and Joe Calzaghe. This one really sort of caught light on the boxing forum. Now, let me start by saying that I'm gonna do this video on the context of it being like a pound for pound fight. I appreciate Joe Calzaghe was effectively a super middleweight who moved out of his comfort zone to light heavyweight, and I appreciate that Sergey Kovalev is a big light heavyweight, cutting drastically to get down to light heavyweight. What I'm getting at is I know that Kovalev is clearly a much bigger man than Joe Calzaghe, but for the purposes of this video I'm not going to focus on that. I'm going to focus on who is the better pound for pound fighter in a fictional matchup. I hope that makes sense. I'm probably going to look at both sides of the argument, and as I say, there's been some excellent points already made on the forums, etc. But here's my take on it. Joe Calzaghe is someone I'm a massive fan of. He was one of my favourite boxers of the time, certainly. And I think the thing about Joe was that he always found a way to win. He wasn't, in my opinion, the greatest technical fighter of all time. He wasn't the best defensive fighter, and he didn't have the most power. Certainly Sergey Kovalev hit harder than Joe. Very possibly Bernard Hopkins, well, more than very possibly, almost certainly you could say Bernard Hopkins is a better defensive fighter than Joe. And Sergey Kovalev was able to defeat Bernard Hopkins and overcome his defences. But with Calzaghe, he did always find a way to win. I know people question his resume and question how many truly elite fighters did he beat. It's certainly true that when he beat Roy Jones and Bernard Hopkins, who are probably the two biggest names on his resume, those guys weren't at their peak, but both of those guys have fought on. Bernard Hopkins at an elite level, Roy Jones Jr. at a semi-elite level at best. And I think it's harsh to say Joe beat an ageing, weak Bernard Hopkins when we consider that Sergey Kovalev's crowning moment was beating Hopkins many years later when he was even older. So you can certainly make a case that Calzaghe's resume is slightly padded and not the strongest out there. But in my opinion, you can make an even stronger case that Kovalev's resume is padded. You know, Kovalev has beaten some decent fighters: Cornelius White, Ismail Salak, Nathan Cleverly, who I rate highly, but is quite a divisive figure. Some people think he's world level, some people think he's not more than British level. Bernard Hopkins. But the point is that he beat Bernard Hopkins when Hopkins was nearing 50. And when Hopkins had stayed in his position as a world champion by feeding on a lower level of opposition in the last couple of years, if we're honest. So my point is that Kovalev's resume is unproven at a very elite level. Don't get me wrong, I did a video the other day where I said I would consider Kovalev in my top 10 of the global pound for pound list at present. But if we're talking at a real elite level, a sort of Hall of Fame level, comparing him to Joe Calzaghe, at that sort of Hall of Fame level, Kovalev doesn't have a complete resume yet. And nor should we expect him to, because he's in the middle of his career and we should expect him to have big fights in the next year or two. My point is, the obvious argument against Joe Calzaghe is his, quality of opposition in the early to middle stages of his career. My point is that whilst I acknowledge that to be a fair comment, I don't necessarily think Sergey Kovalev has beaten better opposition just yet. He may well go on to, but not just yet. Their biggest win, arguably, for both came against Hopkins, and Hopkins was a lot younger when he fought Joe. Anyway, moving on from that point, Joe Calzaghe was a fighter who'd always find a way to win and was adaptable across different opponents. He fought the technician in Bernard Hopkins. I know that was controversial, but Joe won that fight. And he was able to show that he could go in with a highly intelligent, ring-savvy vet and get the job done. He also fought guys at the time who were considered, at least by large sections of the public, to be unstoppable forces, juggernauts, in the same way that people now consider Sergey Kovalev. You know, Jeff Lacey, Mikhail Kessler. In my opinion, Calzaghe's early win over Kessler arguably represents his strongest piece of actual boxing form. This was Mikhail Kessler in beast mode, when Mikhail Kessler was, a real unstoppable force. The same Mikhail Kessler who went on to beat Carl Froch. Let's not forget that. And Calzaghe got the job done against him. Calzaghe got the job done against Lacey, when in certain sections, I think possibly even with the bookmakers, Lacey was favourite. Lacey was being... I know certain people would again say Lacey had a padded record, and I'm sure that's true, but Lacey was being talked about. I remember at the time, like a Mike Tyson type figure, and there were big questions about whether Joe would have enough power. But in that fight, Joe gave probably, whilst I say that Hopkins was his most high profile success, whilst I say that Kessler was his best success, against Lacey, Joe was probably at his most dominant. He didn't stop, he didn't knock him out like Sergey Kovalev finished his opponents, but it was brutal domination. Joe's work rate, Joe's speed, the variety to Joe's punching was fantastic. It was sheer dominance. And Jeff Lacey was being talked about, as was Mikhail Kessler, in a not dissimilar light. I'm not saying it's exactly the same, but in a not dissimilar light to Sergey Kovalev. People viewed these opponents as beasts. They viewed them as unstoppable forces. They viewed them as like a new boxer who was going to take over. But Joe damaged Lacey. A lot of people say Lacey was just a rubbish fighter. I don't buy into that. I'm not saying he was a great fighter, but I'm saying the mark Joe Calzaghe left on him, the dominant beating Joe inflicted, is one of the major reasons Lacey didn't go on to have a great career, in my opinion. I think that fight took so much out of him. Joe has certain assets over Kovalev. Joe's a faster fighter, more agile. They're both front foot heavy, but I think Joe has a slightly higher work rate. Kovalev sometimes has a tendency to stand square on. And you can see Joe just sort of flurrying all over him, like landing punches left, right and centre, bringing it for every second of every round. There were times in that Hopkins fight, and obviously Hopkins is a class act, but there were times in that fight, despite Kovalev's dominance, where Hopkins had small spells of success, was able to land. And I just wonder whether Joe's aggression, whether he'd find a way to win. On the other side of the argument, as I say, I think with Joe, saying will he find a way to win is an easy thing to say, but the reason I do that is this is a guy who found a way to win against Mikhail Kessler, found a way to win against Bernard Hopkins, found a way to win against Roy Jones Jr. Joe's got attributes. With Sergey Kovalev, again, there are arguments to say that he'd be successful. His victory over Bernard Hopkins, even despite the fact that Hopkins was a lot older, was a lot more dominant than Calzaghe's decision, which was controversial. There was no controversy when Kovalev beat Bernard Hopkins. He destroyed him. undeniably, Kovalev also has the edge in power. Joe Calzaghe wasn't a devastating puncher. Sergey Kovalev has got that in droves. As I've already mentioned, Joe Calzaghe wasn't the most accomplished defensive fighter of his era. He had a tendency to get hit, and he did get dropped. Look at the last fights of his career. Hopkins, Roy Jones, these are ageing fighters. Hopkins especially isn't known as a massive puncher at light heavyweight. But Joe did get dropped. He was susceptible to getting hurt in fights. And a fighter like Sergey Kovalev brings more power than the guys who dropped him. Would Joe's potential to get hit clean, would Joe's potential to get hurt not be able to stand up to Kovalev's power? I think that's a fair suggestion. What Joe did show was incredible durability, incredible powers of recovery, incredible resilience. Even, these fights where he's been dropped, he came back, he recovered, he fought on, and he won. Every single time he won. He was someone who got hit, he was someone who got hurt, but his powers of recovery, his fitness was second to none. And when Joe Calzaghe got dropped, it didn't mean the night was over. Perhaps it would be a similar situation to Kovalev's fight with Hopkins, but Kovalev could catch Joe Calzaghe. He could drop Joe Calzaghe. It's certainly a distinct possibility that could happen. But Calzaghe could jump up just like Bernard Hopkins did and get back into the fight. It wouldn't be the end of the night if you land clean on Joe Calzaghe necessarily. I think there's certainly a case for both men in this argument. Calzaghe, whilst I do consider him an all-time great, he was hittable. He did have a propensity to get hurt. He did lack elite level power. However, what he did was show immense versatility against a vast array of opponents. He showed an extreme endurance which we're yet to see, and an extreme work rate which we're yet to see at the same elite level from Sergey Kovalev. And I really see this as a tough fight to call. Calzaghe, the edge in stamina, the edge in speed, the edge in work rate. Possibly Kovalev still slightly square on. Calzaghe possibly the best form, beating a young Kessler, etc. Whereas Kovalev bringing the power, bringing into the fact that Joe did have the potential to get dropped at times. It's a fight that is a genuine 50-50 fight. And even though I'm about to make a prediction as to which side of the line I'm going to fall on, I recognise that this one genuinely could go either way. But I'm with Joe Calzaghe. I think it's very possible to look like an unstoppable force in the early stages of your elite career, like Sergey Kovalev has. But it was also possible for the same to be said of Mikhail Kessler and Jeff Lacey. And against those guys, a peak Calzaghe found a way to win. Speed kills, Calzaghe's work rate, come forward style kills. Kovalev, whilst I think he's a pound for pound fighter of the present generation, I think we have to consider Calzaghe an all-time great. Kovalev's power wouldn't be enough on its own to win this fight. Joe was too durable, too resilient. And I still don't think Kovalev has beaten the level of opponent to prove that he could beat a peak all-time great that would be represented by a peak Calzaghe. I see it as a close fight. Wouldn't surprise me at all if Joe got dropped. But I think after the early rounds, I could see Joe landing relentlessly. I could see Kovalev being slightly too square on. And I could see Joe winning in a close points decision, with him sweeping the late rounds. I appreciate that conclusion may cause a lot of upset amongst some diehard Sergey Kovalev fans who thinks he's the Terminator. Don't get me wrong, I'm a fan of the guy. I'm a big fan of Bernard Hopkins. I'm an even bigger fan of Nathan Cleverly. And he dominated both of those guys. Big fan of Kovalev. But the guy is a human. The guy is not the Terminator. And I need to see him take on Adonis Stevenson. I need to see him fight Eleider Alvarez, Adonis Stevenson, John Pascal, and several more before we can compare him to an all-time great and a Hall of Famer like Joe Calzaghe. Thanks for watching.